You know, it's been said that when it comes to numbers, there are really only three types of people in the world. There are those who can count and those who can't. But when it comes to change, it seems to me that people fall really into one of only two extreme categories. At the one extreme, we have the changeophiles, people who like change and so who tend to see change, or at least the possibility of change, all around them. These people will find common cause with the ancient Greek philosopher Heraclitus. He felt that everything was undergoing constant transformation. Everything, every object, every person, every idea, every society was in a continuous state of what he called Heraclitean flux. His philosophy is summed up in the well-known aphorism, "The only constant is change." Now, at the other extreme, we find, if not changeophobes, at least change skeptics. These folks tend to feel that day to day, year to year, even decade to decade, everything stays pretty much the same. Sure, there's lots of activity, but that's all motion, not progress. Heat, not light. Dissonance, not resonance. I call this the ecclesiastical school, after the verse from Solomon's book of Ecclesiastes, that when it comes to first principles, there really is no new thing under the sun. Now, each of these two schools tends to feel that their perspective offers the greatest deal of insight into any trend of any material moment, and this is certainly the case when it comes to the Internet of Things. The ecclesiasticals argue that the fundamental technologies that define the Internet of Things have been around in identifiable form really for decades. The sensor technology that drives a radio frequency identification tag may be very different from what you might find in a Fitbit, but the fundamental purpose remains the same: to make the invisible visible. The bespoke communications networks that drove electronic data interchange have grown up to become the Internet. And while the technological advances may well be measured in orders of magnitude, once again, the fundamental purpose remains unchanged. Perhaps even the most hyped aspect of the Internet of Things, the advent of true artificial intelligence, was already old news when the UNIVAC came along in the 1950s. It's because of all this gloss and glimmer that we are at real risk of overstating the impact of the IoT. But wait, says Heraclitus, the IoT is a very big deal. After all, whether it's a transition from hunter-gatherer to agriculture, from agriculture to manufacturing, from manufacturing to services, the fundamental engines of wealth creation have changed only 3 times in the last 10,000 years. The Internet of Things promises only the 4th such transformation, this time from services to a fundamentally information-based economy, one in which we have data at scale and scope on all manner of objects, including people, and the augmented intelligence required to extract meaning from or impose meaning on those data. If anything, it's only too easy to understate the impact of the Internet of Things. Now, at this point, you might be expecting me to say that the truth lies somewhere in the middle. But no, I don't think the truth lies in the middle. In fact, I don't think the truth lies at either of those two extremes. I think that the truth lies at both extremes simultaneously. In other words, the Heraclitean perspective captures one dimension of how the IoT affects business strategy, and the ecclesiastical view another. Specifically, when it comes to how companies create value, I think the IoT heralds a true transformation. In other words, what determines the size of the pie is utterly new. But when it comes to value capture, how organizations capture value in competition with their ecosystem partners, and for that matter, in competition with their customers, I believe that remains largely unchanged. In other words, what determines the size of your slice is utterly the same. When it comes to the transformation in value creation, I think that's a function of the rise of information value loops as a complement to supply chains as an instrument of wealth creation. Now, let me tell you what I mean by that. Time was an object like a tennis racket, competed on the basis of its attributes: its strength, its rigidity, its weight, the size of the sweet spot, its price, its availability, and so on. And these attributes were functions of that product's supply chain, the essentially linear series of steps that transform raw inputs into finished outputs. Now, however, thanks to the Internet of Things, objects like tennis rackets and much else besides compete not only on the basis of their supply chains, but also, and increasingly perhaps primarily, on the basis of the information that arises from their use. So in the case of our tennis racket, the act of hitting a tennis ball triggers sensors in the handle. Those sensors create data. Those data can be communicated via wireless networks. They can be aggregated and then analyzed to allow us to compare a particular player's performance with a population of other similar players, generating feedback that can be used as a basis for performance improvement over time. We have not just now a supply chain, but an information value loop. More fundamentally, note that a supply chain is essentially an entropic system. That is to say, raw materials go in one end, they are transformed, and as soon as that finished product comes out the other end, it begins to degrade. But with an information value loop, the act of driving information through those stages to create value gives rise to yet more information, and so the opportunity to create yet more value. It's more nearly self-perpetuating. Now, where value creation is transformed, value capture remains as ever, I think, best understood in terms of the twin concepts of competitive position, where to play, and competitive advantage, how to win. Take the modern pharmaceutical industry as an example. Here's a simplified supply chain view. We have bulk chemicals going in at the one end, we have pharmaceutical research and development and drug manufacture in the middle, and we have retail distribution at the deliver end of things. Now, which of these links in this supply chain do you think is the most economically attractive? Well, as an empirical matter, it's the make link. Pharmaceutical companies tend to be systematically more profitable than either their chemical suppliers or their retail distribution partners. Now, why is that? Well, I think a large part of the answer lies in the fact that pharmaceutical companies enjoy a superior competitive position. They sit on the bottleneck in that supply chain because they are solving, relatively speaking, the hardest problem. Now, the specific pharmaceutical companies that solve those hardest problems best, well, they enjoy a superior competitive advantage, and they do best of all. But there's a hitch, and it's one that reveals the limits of what a supply chain can achieve. In the pharmaceutical industry, the effectiveness of pharmaceuticals depends largely on whether or not people take their drugs as prescribed. And that's something that we have extraordinarily little insight into. We don't really know when people are taking their drugs, if they're not taking their drugs, and as a consequence, we can't develop remedial action. It's very, very difficult to make any real progress based on large-scale population studies. It's not something that the supply chain has been able to do much to address. This is pretty much the state of the art when it comes to tracking what pills you should take when. Now, thanks to the Internet of Things, we can imagine a value loop that could do vastly better. Sensors presumably could track when and if people were taking their medications. Those data could be communicated, aggregated, and analyzed in ways that would allow us to promote better patient compliance. Combining those data with health outcomes would allow us to perhaps improve the drug regimen itself and, at the limit, create even better drugs. But for all of its attractiveness, that ecosystem is ferociously complex to create. I mean, it involves patients and caregivers and physicians and hospitals, insurance companies, governments, IT solutions providers. In that particular Game of Thrones, who wins? Well, it turns out that I think the very same concepts that allowed us to understand why pharmaceutical companies do so well in the pharmaceutical industry supply chain allow us to figure out where the real value lies in this information value loop. So, where's the bottleneck? Well, I think it lies at the create stage. We simply lack the raw data on who is doing what in order to get the rest of the value loop going. How could we solve that problem? Well, enter GlowCap. GlowCap is a product that was designed and commercialized by David Rose, a scientist and an entrepreneur based at the MIT Media Lab in Boston, Massachusetts, and it's a product that's described in his book, Enchanted Objects. With the GlowCap, sensors in the bottle cap track whether or not the cap has been removed, and so working on the assumption that, well, if you've opened a bottle, you're probably going to take your medication, and perhaps the even more reasonable assumption that if you haven't opened the bottle, then you're probably not taking the medication. GlowCap gives us a pretty good proxy for patient compliance. You might say they're solving the bottleneck with the bottle cap. So they've got a great competitive position. sitting on the bottleneck in the information value loop. But what about competitive advantage? After all, GloCap is not the only player in this space. Well, in some studies, they have proved to be a dramatically more reliable source of data than self-reported, and they've actually been able to improve patient compliance by upwards of 25%. So as a consequence, they seem to have a pretty reasonable competitive advantage. So with a good competitive position, where to play, in the bottleneck on the value loop, and a reasonable competitive advantage compared to alternative suppliers, I'd suggest that the GloCap has a bright future. Now, two issues that have long been critically important in our increasingly information-centric lives, and I think they deserve mention here as well, namely security and privacy. Now, identity theft has long been a concern, pardon me, and it's something that has been heightened by the rise of the internet. Having your financial information stolen, for example, can result in consequences that range anywhere from a material inconvenience to financially ruinous. The Internet of Things raises the stakes much further. With its autonomous self-driving cars and its smart electrical grid, security in the age of the IoT can become a matter of life and death. If someone hacks your credit cards, that can cost you your credit rating. If someone hacks your self-driving car, that can cost you your life. Now, when it comes to privacy, time was on the internet, no one knew you were a dog. Now, thanks to social media, that's been turned around 180 degrees. It's precisely because you're on the internet that everyone knows you're a dog. And once again, the IoT has raised the stakes dramatically. When you see an ad on TV or delivered up next to your search results, you understand the bargain that you've struck. But as we track more and more dimensions of our behavior in more and more aspects of our lives, and we're able to aggregate and analyze those data at population levels, it becomes increasingly the case that we are at risk of being manipulated without even being aware of it. So, as you think about how the Internet of Things affects business strategy, I submit that at the Heraclitean end of the spectrum, we find value creation utterly transformed by the new technologies that define information value loops. At the ecclesiastical end of the spectrum, I say we'll find value capture, still explained best by the fundamental tried and true concepts of competitive position, where to play, and competitive advantage, how to win. Security and privacy remain as salient as ever, perhaps even more so. When you put it all together, I'd like to suggest that we can find now not just cliché, but perhaps even true insight in that old saw, plus ça change, plus c'est la même chose. If you'd like to learn more about these ideas, I'd encourage you to take a look at our website. It has a number of research reports written by myself and some of my colleagues at Deloitte that explore these technologies and some of these issues. Watch for this link to be tweeted from the TM Forum Twitter account. Thanks very much for your time. Enjoy the rest of the conference.